Good morning. On behalf of the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program, including the FASTER group, it's my privilege to welcome you all and to also welcome the perspectives and contributions from Dr. Laura Biven from the Office of Science and Department of Energy. Those of you that don't recognize my voice, I'm Bob Chaddick from the Division of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure in NSF, and I had the privilege of being your co-chair this morning, along with my colleague, Dr. Robert Bond from NIST. We have a large number of contributors and interesting people joining us this morning. So what I would suggest is basically we'll hold our questions to the end, and that way we can make sure that everyone has ample time to raise any questions or thoughts they have. So with that, Dr. Biven, it's my privilege to welcome you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with this group and to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with regard to data management in the Department of Energy and in the Office of Science. And maybe just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Okay. So I work in the Department of Energy in the Office of Science, and that's the basic research funding part of the Department of Energy. And we actually have data management policy for the entire department, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on what we're doing in the Office of Science because I think that's probably most relevant for this group, and also because that's where most of the scientific data are being produced. I mean, as a result of the funding from the Office of Science. So before I tell you a little bit about our policies in the Office of Science, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the data that the policies apply to. So the Office of Science is about a $5 billion organization annually. We directly fund about 22,000 researchers at 300 or so institutions and all of the 17 DOE national laboratories. And in addition, we design, build, and operate a number of scientific user facilities. And through those user facilities, we touch another 30,000 or so users. So those are people that are coming in to have time on the user facilities that may or may not be funded by DOE. In fact, many of them are NSF funded or funded from other agencies. So we have a very diverse portfolio in the Office of Science. We split up our portfolio into 6 program offices, roughly aligned with a research discipline. So there's the Advanced Scientific Computing Research Office. So think big computers and data and networking. There's also our Basic Energy Sciences Office, which is very focused on chemistry and material science. And there's also our Biological and Environmental Research Office, which has both biology for biofuels as well as climate science. Fusion Energy Sciences is focused on developing a fusion energy source. High Energy Physics is focused on looking at the universe at its most fundamental level. So looking at the nature of particles and the Standard Model and things like that. And then Nuclear Physics also, which is looking at nuclear matter. We steward 10 of the Department of Energy national laboratories. And some of these are single-purpose laboratories. So, for example, Fermilab focuses primarily on high-energy physics. But many of them are multi-purpose. And so they're getting funding from multiple offices within the Office of Science, as well as offices in other parts of the department, as well as other agencies and private industry. So these are places where, the basic research is touching the applied and development and the private sector, and it's really these labs serve really as a nexus of all of these different types of funding and can look at some of these activities really from, throughout the technology levels, right? So technology readiness levels, from the basic research all the way to the applied. A little bit about our user facilities. So our user facilities are things like supercomputers, light sources, neutron sources, genomic sequencing facilities, atmospheric monitoring centers. In general, they have an owner in one of those 6 program offices that I talked about, and they're hosted almost always by a laboratory. So they're designed and built and operated by a laboratory. And we have now a precise definition of what we call a user facility, and there are a number of things that the facility has to do in order to meet that definition. And one of them is that they have to allow free access. It's openly accessible for open research. So provided you plan on publishing your results, you can get access for free through a peer-reviewed mechanism. And they also allow proprietary research, but it's full cost recovery. We've recently started tracking that's a bad word. We've recently started analyzing the type of users that come to our facilities. So we're looking at, where these users are coming from, which institutions, which congressional districts, things like that. But in the course of that, we were able to look at whether users were using multiple user facilities at the same time. And so this is really the first year that we've had these kind of crossover statistics where you can see, so they're all acronyms, so you won't know what they mean, but I'll explain it to you. So you can see how the different user facilities are being used by the same user. And something that I want to point out is you'll see, for example, NERSC, which, I don't know if I have a pointer, but anyway, it's sort of 3/4 of the way down, has a big cross-section with the other user facilities. Okay, there we go. But it doesn't work. Never mind. It has a big cross-section with the other user facilities, and that makes sense because that's a high-performance computing center that many of our Office of Science-funded researchers use in conjunction with some of the other user facilities. So that's sort of a heavily used thing across the Office of Science, and it would make sense. Yes?
Are there any government agencies in that, or is it primarily scientists and academics?
These are all of the user facilities that are owned and operated by the Office of Science in DOE.
So it's not other companies like NASA?
No, this is just Office of Science. That's right. Yeah, and so in here there are light sources and computing centers, neutron sources, high-energy physics labs, fusion experiments, things like that. And one of the things that we didn't really know before we were able to do these statistics is the real crossover between, for example, light sources and neutron sources. We don't know we don't have the granularity to say that they're actually doing it sort of for the same study. In other words, they're putting the same kind of sample in front of neutrons and in front of photons, but we know that at least the same teams are using both of these resources. And in particular, something I'm going to talk about later is the intense coupling between some of our user facilities and compute and our computing facilities. This slide is just meant to impress you with the fact that we have that there are users, our researchers are generating large amounts of data, and so this is from a recent report that came out, and it shows in the current or near term the amount of data that these different user facilities are producing. So climate simulations, ARM is our atmospheric radiation measurement facility, ALS is a light source, LCLS is a light source, the neutron sources, the electron microscopies, APS is a light source, and DUNE is a soon-to-be high-energy physics intensity frontier experiment. And so it shows, sort of the as-is state, and then in the long term, how much they expect to be producing. And you can see that it's, sometimes orders of magnitude more. I mean, you have to take the long term with a little bit of a grain of salt. They're extrapolating or they're sort of guessing, but some of it is really based on planned upgrades as well. So the growth is real. So we've been hearing from our community that there is not only this large amount of data that are coming, that we're going to have to deal with coming off of our user facilities, but also that there's a growing need to integrate this with our compute facilities. So there's a trend towards the convergence of data and computing. Our Federal Advisory Committee told us that it's just a mistake to think about these things as separate. You have to think about them as integrated. And for many problems, we're seeing sort of almost a new, well, you must be seeing it as well, there's a new paradigm of science, which is where you really need computing power, high-performance computing power, in order to even understand your experimental or observational results. So this shows you so this is sort of one way of understanding the amount of data that are being produced, and that is by looking at the amount of traffic across our Energy Sciences Network, ESNet. And it shows, on the left-hand side, it shows you that this growth is exponential. And on the right-hand side is a sort of comparison of the growth of the traffic across ESNet versus the traffic across the Internet. And ESNet is the elephant footprint because it's fundamentally sort of different type of data that are going across the network. They're big data sets that are being pushed across the network. And the little mouse footprint is the Internet, and because they're little packets of data. So the way in which you manage these networks is completely different. Of course, the Internet has more data overall. That graph is a little misleading in that way, but it's just meant to show the comparison of growth. This is another way of looking at that same phenomenon, and this is looking at the traffic in and out of our supercomputing facility at Berkeley, which is NERSC. And on the top, you see the blue is the data going into NERSC, and the orange is the data coming out of NERSC. So NERSC is now a net importer of data. And on the bottom, you've just filtered out for the data coming off a single experiment at our light source at SLAC. So the single experiment, basically tripled the amount of data going into NERSC. Here are a couple of examples to show you the ways in which simulation and data are now intertwined. So these are the examples where you really cannot do the experiment or you cannot understand your observational data without simulation. So there's a case in cosmology, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also in materials science, for example, where they're actually modeling, what happens at the light source. So they're not just modeling what happens in the material, but they're actually what's happening when you put the material in the light source. And that system, that integrated system, is complicated enough that you need simulation in order to tell you how to run your experiments. In cosmology, they use simulation in a number of different ways. They use it as to understand their cosmological probes, so like standard candles and things like that, to develop mock skies, so where they can test their data workflows that they will then use on the experimental observational data, and also sort of in an ensemble way to control for systematics in the observations that they get. In material science, there's now a push towards trying to create libraries about materials that you can then use to, to sort of guide which materials you should look at next or which materials you should test in a certain way. And this is showing a sort of proof of concept that they did a couple of years ago using simulation data about neutron experiments that they then used to drive the analysis of data that they were getting from the neutron source. This is, excuse me, this slide sort of shows a possible future at how, at our light sources and how data would be managed at the light source. So right now, the user facility provides photons. And it's up to each beamline to figure out how to capture the data from their experiments and how to determine formats and standards and how to analyze those data, and a lot of that happens off-site. There's a recognition now that that doesn't scale to the volumes of data that are coming out of the user facilities given the detector upgrades. And so there has to be more in-house support for data reduction and data analysis and things like that. And there's a lot of applied mathematics that goes into that. There's a cultural issue, but there's also an applied mathematics issue of how you can do that, how you can do some analysis on the fly in real time, where what computing resources do you tap into, and how do you make it more or less real time so that it can inform the experiment as it's happening. And so this sort of shows a future vision of how data management might work at a light source. In climate as well, for our atmospheric radiation measurement facility, there are, of course, inherent limitations in observational data about the atmosphere. You only have it at certain points and certain resolution and certain measurements that you can make. And so what they're doing now is they're trying to regularize the way in which they use simulation to fill in the gaps. So they're not just doing this on an ad hoc way. They want to do this on a regular basis where the data from your observation would inform and drive the simulation, and then the simulation would sort of interpolate between your observations. I wanted to just make sure that you had references for a number of reports. So I've highlighted here mainly reports coming out of our Advanced Scientific Computing Research Office, although there are other very interesting reports coming out of the other offices. But Oscar really looks across the Office of Science, and so this is, if you wanted a sort of summary view, this is it. This last one on the bottom is very recent. It's from a workshop that happened in October or September, and it gets your attention. It really says that basically at every point in the data life cycle for data coming off of the user facilities, there are issues with data management and dealing with the volumes of data and trying to figure out how you can connect to computing resources to do the science you need. Yeah?
Quick question, Laura. So most of the facilities are people are actually going to the facility, they're gathering their data, and then it's coming off. But there are other cases like ARM where, sort of a streaming system where the users may be everywhere and are sort of downloading it, or it's available data. So how much of that latter kind of case is also part of this issue of, because at NSF we have both now, and it can be hard to understand what the users are and what the growth needs are, because you don't know exactly who's downloading the data and who's, where the data is going. So is that still sort of a small portion of what you do, or it's growing?
Well, okay, so it's interesting. So we actually have different categories of users. There's on-site users, and then there are remote users, and then there are data users. And on-site users and remote users you can sort of get a handle on, but then some of the usage that you're talking about often is not tracked and is not reflected in the statistics that I talked about. That doesn't mean that they don't also have compute needs.
This is about the ones that you can track and identify somehow.
The statistics are about that. I think that the issues are broader than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's an overlap of the challenges we have as well.
Yeah. So before I pivot to talking about policy, I just wanted to say that I mentioned all of this for a couple of reasons. One is because I wanted to give you a flavor of the sort of data that, that are going to be subject to the policies I talk about, but also because I think there are real opportunities now. It's clear that the research communities are going to have to redevelop and redefine how they think about managing their data, and they're going to be bringing in new techniques into new tools, and it's the perfect time to sort of put hooks in for making best practices of data management easy for our researchers. And so, yeah.
Really good policy. Do you see application of machine language or artificial intelligence being used a lot?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's something we think about, yeah. Okay, so these are some of the findings from that last report that I mentioned. So the first one is that experimental and observational science projects represented in the workshop struggle to keep up with the demands and opportunities that a flood of data offers. So that's just sort of first order. There's an issue. Scientific data is increasingly at risk of being unusable. So that's because people don't have the tools to analyze it, or maybe they have the tools to analyze it once, but they're not keeping any kind of record of provenance, so it can't be reused. Experimental observational science projects are impeded due to significant data life cycle issues, life cycle needs that are largely unmet. So that's pretty much in every stage of the data life cycle, but in particular, preservation. And then one of the case studies about neutron science said that their only archival process right now is that provided by the published journal. So the only place that they're able to keep the data that they think, that is sort of that they would make available to colleagues is in the journal. Okay, so now pivoting to policy issues. So I probably don't have to put this slide here for this audience, but I do it when I'm talking to people outside of Washington. And this is sort of, screenshots of a number of different policies that have to do with data management, and it's a bit of a sea, and people don't know which policies apply to which data and so on. So I'm just going to pull on a thread here. And it's the thread that is relevant for extramural research data, and it's the thread that's most relevant for the Office of Science, because we basically only have extramural research data. So up at the top is the memo that came from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and those are our marching orders. They required that we have and publish a public access plan that addressed both data resulting from our funded research as well as publications. I'm not going to talk about publications, but the punchline is OSCE.gov/pages. That's where you can find full text versions of publications from DOE research. On the data side, so going down the diagonal still, the logical structure is that we have an overall policy for the Department of Energy, and then the policy is tiered. So each office can then have its own sort of supplemental guidance and requirements for its own research communities. And so we have one in the Office of Science that is specific to the Office of Science. And in fact, it goes lower down, so each of our program offices can have supplemental guidance and requirements. And really, the rubber hits the road in the solicitation. So that's where, that's our contract with the research community, and what we put in there is what's binding. So that's the sort of logical flow, but that's not the chronological flow. So I'll just go through a little bit of the history. The starting gun for us was really the Competes Act of 2010, which called for an interagency committee on public access, looking at both publications and data. So we knew at that time that we were going to be involved in interagency discussions leading to some kind of policy recommendations. And we also knew that we were not prepared for that. So one of the first things that we did is we set up a working group within the Office of Science to look at digital data. And at that time, our knowledge about our program managers knew what was happening to the results of their research in terms of publications. They knew where the publications were going and where their results were being published, but they really had no idea what was happening to the data. It was basically all folklore. So one of the first things that we did after we set up the working group was we charged each of our federal advisory committees, and there's one for every one of those programs. So there's 6, one for each of our program offices, some of which are shared with NSF. And we charged each of these federal advisory committees to give us a short report describing how they are disseminating the results of their research at that time, so both publications and data. And those were actually incredibly influential and helpful reports for us that really can see the direct result of those in our policies. OSTP independently put out a request for information about, what should we consider if we're thinking about a policy for data management, and everybody wrote in, universities, professional societies, publishers, the whole lot, and that was also very useful. Once we had a bit of a sense of where things were going, we also reached out to each of our user facilities and said, what would the impact be if we had a policy like this? Because one of the things that we heard from our federal advisory committees was that we wanted to make sure that there weren't any kind of unfunded implicit mandates on our user facilities. We didn't want our user facilities to become data centers by default. Then in February of 2013, the OSTP memo was finalized and came out, and that gave us our marching orders. And a year later, we published our public access plan. And at the same time, the Office of Science piloted the data management requirements. So the Office of Science has had the data management requirements since, the intent was published in the summer, and then they started coming into effect in October. And then a year later, the DOE-wide policy was published. So let me just go through the Office of Science policy because it's just a little bit more specific. It's basically a mirror of what happens at the DOE level, but it's a little bit more specific. So it lives on our website, and it has the following elements. It has a statement of principles, requirements, some additional guidance, which are things that we thought were important to tell our research communities but didn't quite make the cut for being a requirement. And included there are what we call suggested elements for a data management plan. So we didn't want to give a template because we didn't want it to become a check-the-box activity, but we didn't want to give our research communities kind of no guidance about what they should be putting in their data management plan. So we have these suggested elements. Then there are additional requirements from our program offices, so that's sort of the next tier down in the tiered structure I was talking about. And then there's also links to information from our user facilities, and then some definitions and FAQs and so on. So let me just go through some of these in turn. So the principles. The first one says that effective data management has the potential to increase the pace of scientific discovery and promote more efficient and effective use of government funding and resources. And data management planning should be an integral part of research planning. Sharing and preserving data are central to protecting the integrity of science by facilitating validation of results and to advancing science by broadening the value of research data to disciplines other than the originating one and to society at large. And then finally, not all data need to be shared and preserved, and there's some kind of assessment of cost and benefit that has to go on. And that that last bullet is really just to calm the nerves of our research communities because they were freaking out. Okay, so a few caveats before I go into the requirements. So these requirements apply only to proposals that are submitted to the Office of Science for research funding. So proposals that are submitted for workshops or to buy a widget and things like that, that's not covered. The requirements apply to proposals for new, renewal, and some supplemental awards. So the rule of thumb is if it's going to go out for peer review, it should have a data management plan. They apply regardless of the PI's institution. So our labs are covered by this policy, as well as grantee institutions, as well as private industry. They do not apply to the proposals that people would submit to have time on a user facility, because that proposal process is managed by the lab, by the facility. So this is not encroaching on that space at all. There are cases at our national labs where the work is kind of ongoing, and so there isn't necessarily a formal proposal that goes out anymore. There are still, a solicitation that goes out anymore. There are still proposals that come in that are reviewed, but there's no formal solicitation necessarily. It's sort of more of an ad hoc invitation maybe. So in those cases, we've committed to saying, okay, you're going to have a data management plan at some point, and it's up to the program to decide when the best point is. Some of our programs have just said, everyone this year is going to have a data management plan. Others are rolling it in at the next peer review stage. The data management plans are part of the overall peer review process. And then again, just a reference to the tiered structure. So there might be additional requirements and guidance from each of the program offices. Okay, so the requirements. The first one says that you should have a data management plan, and the data management plan should describe whether and how data generated in the course of the proposed research will be shared and preserved. And it must describe how data sharing and preservation will enable the validation of results, or how the results could be validated if the data are not shared and preserved. So the focus is really on the data that the researcher determines is evidence for their research findings. The second requirement is that data management plans should provide a plan for making all research data displayed in publications resulting from the proposed research open, machine-readable, and digitally accessible. And this came directly from our Federal Advisory Committee reports. There were committees that were saying that they were basically still blowing up a PDF and reading off the points, and we decided that was silly. So we chose our words carefully because very often the data that are just, very often you can't go any deeper than the data that are displayed in the publication. So if you go any deeper, you get to a terabyte or something like that. So recently a researcher just told me about basically a simulation that he has embedded in his paper, and that simulation is terabytes of data, and there's no way he could make that accessible in a meaningful way. And so actually we're trying to figure out what that means in terms of this requirement. So there might be limitations on how actionable the data are that you can provide in a digital way, but you still have to make the data available. The third one is really this protection on implicit mandates at our user facilities. So this says the data management plan should consult and reference available information about data management resources to be used in the course of the proposed research. In particular, data management plans that explicitly or implicitly commit data management resources at a facility beyond what is conventionally made available to approved users should be accompanied by a written letter. So how do you know what's conventionally made available? Well, we asked each of our user facilities to have a public-facing site that describes exactly that. So each of them has a site on the website, on their website that describes what data management resources they would make available to proposed users. And if you get a data management plan that goes beyond that, the program manager knows they should expect a letter with it. And the last one just says that you shouldn't do anything illegal or bad for the United States. A couple of definitions. I won't read through the definition, but the important part here is that, as I've said, the definition of digital research data for this policy is that it focuses on the data that are necessary for the validation of the research of the results. So it's the data that the PI determines is evidence for their research findings. And also, we rolled in software and code into our definition. So that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily share the software or code, because we know that people are using proprietary software, but it does mean you have to talk about it in your data management plan if it's necessary to validate your research findings. Data preservation just means providing for the usability of data beyond the lifetime of the research activity that generated them. We took a really broad view of data sharing. So our data sharing definition encompasses everything from answering ad hoc requests to putting things on a website where you have no knowledge of who's accessing it. And we did that intentionally because we didn't want to exclude any forms of data that were being generated by our research, and we wanted to leave it to the PIs to match, the type of data with the best type of sharing. And then I just point out that the way we use validate is the English language definition of validate, not the computational science definition of validate, so it just means someone is able to scrutinize your results and determine whether they're legitimate. So just a couple of screenshots for the resources that we make available to PIs on our website. So this is just showing you a couple of examples of the tiered nature. So these are the additional guidance and requirements from our OSCAR office and our nuclear physics office. This is all of the links to the data management resource pages at the user facilities. And this is the description of those suggested elements for a data management plan. So it goes through the normal things like what types of data are you using, what are the sources, what's the content and format, how do you plan on sharing and preserving those data. But then a couple of things, protection, so is there any reason that you would have to limit access, for example? And then rationale, and rationale has been pretty useful when people use it because it's an opportunity to describe, for example, why you're choosing this method of sharing versus another, and it could be because there isn't a community repository or there are no community standards or so on. And that's very helpful for our program managers to understand the lay of the landscape. There are also prompts in here to talk about when you might relinquish control of your data. So you're submitting your data to a repository, and then it's it's under the management of the repository. Or you might say, I'm agreeing to maintain the data for X number of years, at which point we'll reevaluate whether or not we keep it based on certain criteria. And then finally, the Department of Energy, through our Office of Scientific and Technical Information, provides a service whereby you can get DOIs for free. So if you're DOE funded, you can apply for a digital object identifier for your data, and OSTI will give you one for $7,000 if you need them. And at the moment, this is really being used heavily by some of our public-facing data centers. But in theory, you could apply for a one-off if you just have a one-off, and we're hoping that people will make use of that. Just to show you where the rubber meets the road, this is a screenshot from our open solicitation, which is a solicitation that is open all year round. And it's just basically a cut and paste of those requirements that are on our website into the solicitation. And it has a question for the reviewers in the merit review criteria. So this question is the data management plan suitable for the proposed research, and to what extent does it support the validation of research findings? And this is basically as vanilla as it gets. There are many solicitations that go out that have more pointed or more focused question to the reviewers, but this is as vanilla as it gets. I think that's the end of my slides, but I'm happy to take questions about how we're managing the policy or working. Any questions you might have?
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Thank you for your update and also the grace to provide your perspectives in addition to what you've shared in your slides.